Welcome to the Cannabis Innovators Show at PortfolioWealthGlobal.com. My name is Michelle Holliday. Today we have an amazing interview because Jacob Crow is joining us. Jake is the founder and CEO of Budtender, and our whole team here at Portfolio Wealth Global is very excited to welcome him to the show because of his extensive knowledge of the cannabis industry in Canada, as well as his own personal approach to this business. Jake, welcome to the show. How are you today?
Hey, Michelle, I'm doing wonderful. How are you?
Just great. Jake, for my first question, I want to start right off by switching gears just a little bit into cryptocurrencies, because crypto and cannabis are really the top two most explosive sectors right now, especially among millennial entrepreneurs. From your perspective, is there a connection between these two trends? Since banking is still such a huge challenge in the marijuana industry, is Bitcoin becoming a prominent method of payment? Does this make a positive impact?
I think that there's certainly a lot of similarities between the two industries, and I think it's specifically based around just the amount of high growth going on in both spaces, and as well the opportunity to get into these markets and gain market share. That's where I certainly see the similarities between the two industries. I personally, though, think in terms of cryptocurrencies in cannabis, that it doesn't make a lot of sense to use cryptocurrencies in cannabis currently in Canada, for example, because in a federally regulated market, we have access to banking. But somewhere in the States where it's different and the regulations are a bit more iffy, then it poses a bigger opportunity. But I certainly do see, and I certainly am beginning to see here, especially in Canada, the transition of Bitcoin to becoming a everyday currency. I mean, you can see ATMs for them anywhere in downtown Toronto.
Wow, that's great. So in Canada, because everything is federally legal, banking really is not an issue.
No, because of the federal regulation, which obviously is the biggest difference between Canada and the United States, that's the reason that banking isn't as large of an issue in this industry in Canada as it is in the U.S. Once the U.S. has federal regulation, then the access to banking should become available, and it's the same way that it is here in Canada.
Now, speaking of the United States' impact upon Canada, has Jeff Sessions' recent actions concerning cannabis here in our country affected the industry, in your opinion, or not at all at Canada?
I think actually every single time that any sort of issues happen in the United States, in terms from a enforcement standpoint, that it's always actually a positive for the Canadian market, because investors are then seeking the safer opportunities in this space, which is still growing at the rate it's growing, and then they can do that and invest in Canada where there is not the risk that Jeff Sessions being involved.
Jake, how big is this market getting in Canada, and what are the hottest products right now?
The market this year is projected to be an $8.7 billion market here in Canada. And currently the most popular products really are flowers that are coming from the licensed cannabis producers here. But one trend that is starting to pick up largely here in Canada is the use of soft gels, which are essentially oils, which you can take as essentially an edible, which are trending here greatly in Canada.
Oh, wow, that's interesting. Could you go into that a little bit more?
Sure. So a lot of the licensed cannabis producers are starting to see that a lot of patients are trying to move away from the flower, and especially from, the harmful toxins of actually smoking the plant. And so they're trying to find alternative remedies. And one that they have identified are soft gels, which are essentially oils put into a gel capsule like a ibuprofen. And users are able to then ingest them, and it acts in the same capacity as actually using the flower.
Now, do you guys have the same sort of regulations? Is it comparable to the way that we federally regulate pharmaceuticals?
Yeah, so actually here in Canada, the licensed producers of cannabis follow incredibly strict regulations from the Government of Canada and Health Canada, which means that they have to comply at the essentially highest rate standard of compliance in cannabis today in the world.
Oh, wow. That would probably have its basis in the fact that Canada as a country federally accepts cannabis, and therefore if the pharmaceutical industry has to follow suit.
Absolutely, and that's the whole thing that since Canada has legalized cannabis on day one, for the medical side, it has been a number one priority for the federal government and for Health Canada to prioritize that the cannabis that they are making and the cannabis that's being grown is then safe and suitable for Canadian consumers, and that we're then taking away the opportunity of pesticides and bad chemicals getting into the plant and then potentially harming the consumer.
Jake, what are the overall demographics of this industry's consumers? You had mentioned to me that middle-class women really tend to make up a surprisingly large portion of the cannabis market. Why do you feel that is, and who else dominates the demographics?
Sure. So I really do believe that middle-aged women are going to be probably the driving factor in this market. And the reason being is that there are just the option of the alternative from alcohol in terms of cannabis is huge. And if you start to look at other states in the United States, and you look at, I believe, Colorado and Washington, for example, in the places that cannabis has been legalized, alcohol sales are down up to 15%, which means that people are transitioning away from alcohol and to cannabis, which presents a huge opportunity, of course, for the industry. But, the other customer segments that are still growing and are getting larger and larger, in the medical side, older patients are becoming to be a huge part of the industry, which means that the industry is going to have to adapt to be able to serve them and being able to, essentially educate these people about the benefits of cannabis. But of course, as well, one of the most interesting and obviously one of the rising segments of the industry are young working professionals, so people between 25 and 35 with disposable income, male or female, which are typically our most often consumers of cannabis.
In regards to Canada in particular, it is still a relatively small market, but Canada is just getting off the ground. Can you share with us some real statistics on the cannabis industry's impact upon the Canadian economy? How big is this industry dollar-wise, and how many customers are there for recreational in comparison to medicinal cannabis?
Sure. So in terms of the actual size of the market and the economic impact it has on the country itself, this year, Canada is projecting to do about $22 billion in economic impact through cannabis, whether that be through the growing of the plant, creating jobs, or things along those lines, which obviously you can imagine is going to be a huge driving economic factor for Canadians going forward. In terms of how many customers there are from medical to recreational, Canada has seen substantial year-over-year growth on the medical patient side, which is expected to sustain all the way through the next 5 years and to peak at about 900,000 medical users. But what Canada is projecting in terms of recreational customers, as cannabis becomes fully recreationally legal this summer, that about 30 to 40% of Canadian cannabis consumers will begin to go through the legalized channels. But the biggest hurdle and issue for the government to overcome is to then drive customers away from the black market and into regulated dispensaries.
Ah, that's a very interesting point. Could you expound a little bit on that?
Absolutely. So here in Canada, if you look at just sheer numbers in terms of how many dispensaries we'll have available per population, and then you look at that in comparison to some of the legalized places in the United States, if you look at Canada, which has about 36 million people, and you look at California, which has about 39 million people, they're pretty relative in size. California has over 2,000 dispensaries, and that's about one dispensary per every 9,000 people. Here in Canada, we plan to have about 325 dispensaries for the entire country, which represents one per about every 120,000 people. So as you can imagine, that's a pretty overwhelming difference in just the amount of access there is to cannabis. But to make that problem even worse, we're starting a brand new market, and we're having to compete against the illegal market, which is advanced, it's robust, they have 100 years of experience, and they're also easily accessible to consumers. So in terms of the government and for their counterparts to overcome and make this really the industry it's projected to be, they will need to figure out how to overcome the black market.
I find that amazing. That's just incredible that they have so few dispensaries to cover the entire country. What is that, and do you see that number growing?
Yeah, so the number's certainly going to grow off the basis. I think we're probably ended up seeing in Canada maybe about 500 or 600 dispensaries for the entire country. But the issue is in Canada is that with cannabis being legalized at the federal level, the federal government has then passed down this legislation on to the provincial entities, the provincial governments, and all of them are not cannabis entrepreneurs, they're not cannabis people, they don't really understand the industry. So they put out numbers which they feel will suffice without actually really doing the hard research and understanding, what will we need to do in terms of to beat the black market. The only province in all of Canada that at this point has come out with a number which we feel will suffice to be able to compete and beat the black market is Saskatchewan, who came out with 60 dispensaries for their entire province of about 1.4 million people. If you put that in comparison to Ontario, where I live, Ontario has 14 million people and we're only going to have 40 dispensaries. So that's a pretty staggering number to a province with 1.4 million people and a province with 14 million people and with 10 times the population and almost half the stores.
Wow, that is shocking considering Canada appears to be so much further ahead than the United States on a federal level.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that's where sort of there's a disconnect between Canada and the United States, that there is some positivity to how the U.S. has approached the market because they've approached it from on a state-to-state basis, rather. That's allowed them to create models that work for each of their states and which compete with the black market. I mean, at the end of the day, when you're trying to overcome the black market and you're trying to create a new industry, you have to beat them in many ways. Accessibility is one, pricing is another, and the last is actually understanding the customer and understanding what they want. And so if you can do all those things well, you'll be able to beat the black market out pretty outright. If you use Colorado as an example, I think Colorado is only driving about 15% of all of their sales to the black market, which is pretty good when you look at Washington, and their prices of cannabis are so high that about 50% of all their users are still going through the black market. And so although they've legalized, has the legalization really been that successful in beating the black market and achieving those objectives?
So your competition isn't really alcohol or cigarettes. Your competition is illegal cannabis.
Absolutely. The competition is the dealer on the corner. He is the biggest competition and the biggest threat to legalized cannabis in Canada, because if with these so few number of outlets to actually get retail cannabis in Canada, which means most likely those are going to have very, very long lines, if it's easier for the customer to simply go buy from his dealer off the corner than it is to go buy from a recreational store, that poses a huge problem for the government in achieving their goals.
Do you feel that the overall acceptance for cannabis is growing?
Yeah, I think that's something that's we're certainly trending in the right direction in terms of the acceptance of cannabis. Here in Canada, just because of the widespread now investment in the industry and sort of the access to news, that has really begun to sway the public's opinion on cannabis and sort of the benefits and dangers of cannabis. And that's why, we're starting to see really a progressive state of mind around the cannabis industry.
How do you feel that the older generation in Canada are accepting cannabis?
Well, I think that many of them are very accepting of cannabis, especially because they understand what the economic impact is, and they also understand what the economic impact has been on fighting this sort of war on drugs. And so I think that many of the older Canadians are seeing the benefit in taxation, the benefit in regulation of having safer product on the streets, and all of those things, all of the above.
What about the police officers and the general prison system? What do you think their perspective is on cannabis?
I actually volunteer and coach hockey with a few police officers, and I've had this conversation a few times and sort of asking what they think. And in all honesty, they've told me that cannabis is just very, very low on their priority list. So they see this as an opportunity to, reduce the amount of time that they have to spend on this particular subject and allow them to focus on more important things. Of course, promoting health and safety in the community and all those great things. But I think as well, it's going to certainly ease up the judicial system. Currently, though, in Canada, we do still have some backlog of problems because before legalization has even occurred, illegal dispensaries have sprung up all over the country, and many of these people are now facing huge charges in terms of trafficking and possession, which now are going to actually back up the court system. So there's sort of two ways to look at it from that side of things, but I think in general that we are going to begin to ease up the strain and stress on law enforcement in general.
So there are actually illegal dispensaries. It's not just the person on the corner or somebody at a party. There are actual setups that are completely illegal throughout Canada.
Absolutely. There are storefronts that still completely sell cannabis and are still illegal, but just the police just aren't taking the time to shut them down anymore. The government has come out with much stricter fines for them now. Once legalization takes place, they're going to be facing up to $2 million fines, which of course would put anybody out of business. But the issue with these people is that they can sort of revert back to being drug dealers on the corner again, and with their client list, continue to serve them with the black market product that they're already getting. They've already established a good process of doing business, which means they've got a good clientele, which is an issue to the government once again.
So Canada has its own issues.
Yeah, no question. I think that everybody, when they're going through the process of legalizing cannabis, is going to face issues in several different ways. As we mentioned, all the way from pricing to actually how you understand your customer. Everybody will have different issues, and it's just a matter of how you can solve and overcome them, or what the barriers are to solve those issues.
Jake, please tell us about your own personal background and what influenced you to get into the cannabis industry.
Sure. So I have a background in customer service and marketing. I've worked with companies up here in Canada, such as Coca-Cola Canada and the Honda Indy of Toronto. And so I have an extensive background in marketing and customer service. But what really intrigued me about this industry in particular is the year-over-year growth that it's been experiencing since 2012. And that's what really intrigued me at first. But then what really made me interested was the ability to get into the market and gain market share without the serious competition which you see in other industries. And that's what makes cannabis so unique. And that's what really got me interested in this space, because, this is a space for everybody, for people of all backgrounds to get involved and, become entrepreneurs.
Now, please tell us all about Budtender, how it was created, what it does, and what are your plans for the future in this business?
Budtender is a end-to-end software platform for retailers and regulators in the regulated cannabis industry, not only in Canada, but around the world. Our platform offers about 4 different solutions that allow retailers, regulators to increase accessibility, customer intelligence, and as well better understand their customers. Our first part of our platform is a tracking and compliance platform, which allows retailers to set dispensary or multi-dispensary wide networks to oversee all of their sales from their point of sale systems to the end consumer, with the ability to monitor, track, and audit those in real time and report them directly to the provincial and federal tracking systems. Additionally, we have a mobile ordering platform, which allows dispensaries to offer their customers the ability to order cannabis from anywhere at any time and simply come and pick up the cannabis in store in an exclusive line. We additionally have a customer feedback platform, which can then ask the customer about how their service was or how their experience was after they've actually received their order. So between the tracking compliance, the mobile ordering, and the customer feedback, we have data touch points on the customer all the way through the customer journey, which means when the customer actually gets to the point of sale, we're then able to better sell them on products that they may want or need. And lastly, we license a sales training platform from MJ Hybrid Solutions out of San Diego, which allows us to offer sales training to licensed producers and retailers, which are trying to gain better industry and science knowledge in the space.
So now, I met you in San Diego. I know you have a lot of ties down there, even though your company, Budtender, covers Canada. Now, do you also cover the United States?
Yes, we actually now are beginning to serve the United States. We are working with dispensaries actually from California all the way over to Maine. So we do work with the U.S. now. It's been one of our goals this year is to get a foothold in the U.S. market as we continue to work with Canada and as Canada continues to come on board.
Because of the nature of your company, you actually work quite a bit with the Canadian government.
Yeah, absolutely. We work very closely with Canadian governments, not only provincial governments, but the federal government as well, because we put compliance sort of at the core of our entire company and our entire system. So everything we do is built around being the most compliant company we can possibly be, and as well helping our customers remain as compliant as possible. So we do everything we can to ensure we have great relationships with governments, not only in Canada, but also around the world.
Wonderful. I want to ask you about the opportunities for people to make a living in the cannabis industry or to even make a fortune. Is this sector wide open right now?
Yeah, I think it's certainly wide open, especially with legalization coming here in Canada. I mean, the economic impact and the opportunity for everyday citizens to make a living or, like you said, make a fortune is going to become more and more available. I think in terms of the companies that have really begun to set the stage to be large global entities. Some of that has already begun to happen, which means maybe you're a little late to that party. But it's not to say that technology and other things aren't going to continue to develop, which are going to present huge opportunities for entrepreneurs and everyday people to, like you said, make a living or make a fortune.
Now, Jake, when does Canada become fully legalized for recreational use?
So they've been going back and forth on this date, but it seems like now we're going to be looking at sometime in August of 2018. So sometime August this summer, which should put us in line to have retail sales going on then, which is great.
Perfect. Canada has been legal for medicinal use for quite a while.
Correct. Yes, it has.
How do Canadians feel about the new legal status of cannabis in the United States? And in particular, how do you think they feel about the fact that California is now fully legalized for both medicinal and recreational marijuana?
I think that Canadians see it as sort of this domino effect that's going to be continuing to go on around the world, that as soon as Canada falls, we think everybody else will start to fall around us. And of course, with California being one of the most progressive states, not only in the United States, but in the world, it just poses the opportunity and it piques the interest, certainly, of Canadians. And like we said, the idea of how much of an economic impact this space really will have on society. And so I think that with California coming online, I think Canadians, more than anything, are excited about the fact that this opportunity is going to be extended around the world.
What would you suggest for a new entrepreneur who would like to enter this space?
The biggest thing I'd suggest is just do your research and make sure you understand your market really well, because there are lots of really great opportunities out there in this industry, but it's just a matter of understanding how to get into those markets and what your niche might be, because this industry, of course, has piqued the interest of lots of entrepreneurs at this point, which means there's going to be lots of competition. So if you can really differentiate and do something different, you might have a really, really successful business.
Do you have any suggestions on anything exciting you've seen in the ancillary side of this?
The one platform that I absolutely love on the ancillary side, which I think is going to become huge in the cannabis space, is Event High, which is based out of San Diego. They are bringing a digital ticketing marketplace to cannabis for people who want to go to cannabis events. And this is actually something that I didn't know very much about, but cannabis events are huge around the world, and they actually have no way to have tickets purchased or sold. And so Event High is actually solving an incredibly unique issue that probably no one else is looking at in cannabis, because it's a very sort of off the beaten path in terms of the industry.
That's so interesting, because digital-wise, you can almost do anything and apply it to cannabis, is the truth.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that a lot of the people who have become very successful in this space and who will continue to become successful in this space aren't going to be really innovating a whole lot in this industry, but they're going to be taking really great successful ideas from other industries and applying it to cannabis. And that's certainly just like what we did with Budtenders. We looked at the opportunities in other markets and said, well, how can we apply some of these verticals to cannabis?
Jake, this has been an amazing interview. How can our audience follow your work?
So they can follow us, or they can find us at www.trybudtender.com, or follow us at any of the major social medias at TryBudtender. So that would be wonderful.
Jake, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Michelle.
Jacob Crow, founder and CEO of Budtender. For the Cannabis Innovators Show, I'm Michelle Holliday at PortfolioWealthGlobal.com.